May she rest in peace.
Thank you.
The Senate is now in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
We have announcements. First of all, excuses for absence from Her Honor, the Deputy President, Senator Thompson, Senator Kevin Boyce, Senator Cummins, Senator Monroe Knight, and our chaplain will all be absent today. We may have further announcements. Just we have a brief report. Last meeting, it was actually a mid-air whilst you all were meeting. Mr. Speaker, the Clerk of Parliament, Senator Andretti Boyce, and I, we were on the tail end of our attendance at the 65th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference. And just to note that, a couple of quick observations and a note of encouragement. Mr. Speaker is, of course, a member of the Executive Committee of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and this was the first meeting since 2019, having been suspended because of COVID-19. I attended a small branches conference and chaired a session on wellness indicators for small parliaments. This has to do with alternatives to the GDP per capita as an indicator of welfare and how parliamentarians should take note of these other measures in the decision-making and the legislation. So Senator Drake and Senator Hines would have enjoyed that, I'm sure. But interesting work there. And it's actually in practice in several jurisdictions, and either nationally or in sub-regional parliaments. The Senator Andretti Boyce, he attended the network of parliamentarians with disabilities. And in fact, the Constitution was amended to make recognition of that. That is now a recognized body within the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. And that was quite useful in his role as a member of the National Advisory Committee. What I would say by way of encouragement, and of course the Clerk of Parliament, there is a special meeting of the Society of Clerks at the table. They're engaged in professional development, exchange ideas, network, and Mr. Eastman, like his predecessor, great George Branker, are well known and respected in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association circles. But I want to encourage, though, one of the things coming out of the conference is that parliamentarians need to be reminded of the availability of online professional development through the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association's Academy, the CPA Academy. If you go on the CPA website, it's a big tab there inviting you. You go register, indicate which parliament you're from, you set up your username and password, and the courses are free to parliamentarians. And so members of the House, members of the Senate, they're all available there, and I would encourage you to make use of them. I've done several of them myself. There are some for beginners, some for advanced people, a range of topics, some directly parliamentary, others which will enable greater awareness, for example, those on climate change and the like. So I want really to use this opportunity of the announcements of our presence at the meeting to exhort you to make use of this free professional development opportunity for parliamentarians via the CPA Academy. Those are the announcements for today.
Minutes to be confirmed, sir. Minutes of meeting held on Wednesday?
Yes, that's right. Thank you for the reminder. I so got caught up in using my minutes that I forgot the minutes. But we have before us for confirmation minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, August 10th, 2022.
Mr. President, I beg to move the aforementioned minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of August the 10th, 2022 be confirmed. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The minutes stand confirmed.
And those
Oh, sorry. And additionally, there are the minutes of our meeting held on Friday, August the 30th, also to be confirmed.
President, I beg to move that the aforementioned minutes be also confirmed.
Thank you, Senator Walker. The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on Friday, August 30th, 2022 be confirmed. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The minutes of Friday, August the 30th, 2022 are confirmed.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate moved by a minister, introduction of bills, public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, sir.
Order number 4.
In the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 4 of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022-12, that Parliament approve A, the counter guarantee agreements with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Nature Conservancy of up to approximately Barbados 300 million to enable the government to buy back or prepare more expensive existing debt on the terms and conditions of the agreement. B, the conservation funding agreement for the purpose of paying the net savings over 15 years to a local trust which will manage conservation work. And C, the environmental and conservation commitments under the Conservation and Sustainability Commitments Agreement.
Senator Walker.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would want to seek your indulgence to have resolution number 4 and resolution number 5 debated in a cognate debate as they are inextricably linked.
The question is that the two items so mentioned be treated as a cognate debate. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Please proceed, Senator Walker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I rise this morning to commence debate on this resolution, I think I need to give some context as to the reasons there's been a lot of discussion in the public domain as relates to this whole matter of the debt for nature swap. I believe a number of persons don't understand what it is all about. And certainly the mischief makers in social media, perhaps opposition, perhaps people with their agenda, have started to stir confusion by emitting the usual nonsense sometimes to raise fears and to bring about a lot of misinformation. And I think this morning, in what I expect, Mr. President, I'll say at the outset, that I expect that the honorable colleagues on both sides of this chamber will certainly rally with the government and come to the support these resolutions, which can only inure to the benefit of Barbadians now and in the future. But Mr. President, in 1994, April 1994, towards the end of April 1994, there was a major conference held in Barbados. This was a UN conference on sustainable development of small island developing states. I think a number of us would remember it. I'm not sure when I looked across, look on this side and on that side, what stage of development some of my colleagues were in 1994. It was only 28 years ago. But that is important because out of that conference came the Bridgetown Declaration, but more importantly, the Barbados Program of Action, which spoke to a number of specific areas related of importance to small island development states and related to the environment, which were to be addressed. And I believe since then, we've had a review after 10 years, and more recently, after 20 years after this conference. But among those programs of action, they spoke specifically to two which are of concern to us in this matter today. One was a section on coastal and marine resources, and the other one on biodiversity resources. Mr. President, over the years, the CZMU, Coastal Zone Management Unit, has been doing tremendous work. And the purpose of all of this is to assist them in terms of the work that they have been doing and more work that they will need to do. And obviously today's resolutions will take this entire process, important actions in conservation which are necessary in Barbados at this time. And Mr. President, I know you will agree with me that this is something that we should be concerned about and which we have taken for granted in the past. The fish stock, commonly we speak of flying fish stock, and the numbers have dwindled. And I see a number of persons here who live in coastal areas. I see one or two, like my colleague, Reverend Rogers, I'm not sure as it relates. You too, you're from St. George. So in those days, you, Mr. President, I'm sorry, we talked back, certainly when I was at school decades ago, we made fun of people from the central parts of Barbados never seeing a flying fish fly over the water, out of the water, or never seen a flying fish and held it up, never enjoyed the delicacy of roasted flying fish on the beach, only saw it filleted and deboned. And now I wonder, what percentage of Barbadians, especially the younger Barbadians, can tell you that they've ever seen a flying fish flying? Have ever seen it as it looks in its natural form? Of course, there's also the matter, and Mr. President, the contentious matter of the dwindling resources, sea eggs, sea urchins. These used to be a delicacy. You go on beaches and see people cleaning sea eggs, eating them raw, cooking them, boiling them on the beach. And now, how many younger Barbadians have ever seen a sea egg, far less tasted it? And these are some of the things that we need to be concerned about. Mr. President, you might not have suffered. They were the black sea urchins, popularly called the cobblers. And an experience, normally when you went around the coral, in the nearshore areas, the rocky areas, you had the pleasure of having some of these spines in your feet. It was not a pleasant experiment. I mean, I'm in an honorable chamber. Some treatments included getting someone to urinate on your foot, using candle grease, using various poultices. But when last have you seen one? And these are some of the things that I'm talking about that we need to be concerned about. Free cakes, sprats, jacks, conger eels, these are the things. I don't know if my honorable colleague on this side, who always speaks about fishing, etc., knows about any of this. And I'm speaking about you. But you know, Mr. President, this is what we are up against, and I think we go along merrily in Barbados, and we are not taking note, not cognizant of what is really happening to us. Seahorses, we dried, we kept them as souvenirs. I'm sure many of you would ask you, what is a seahorse? Sea cockroaches. We collected them in biology at Lodge School. These were used as bait. And of course, the more popular, which is still done in parts of Silver Sand, the picking wills and dipping them in the seawater and eating them raw. These are the things that Barbadians of not so long ago indulging, and these things were plentiful. And as a result, perhaps, some would say of development, they are no more. And I believe the purpose of these resolutions is to ensure that we can stop this situation and perhaps encourage the regeneration of these animals that were part of our biodiversity. We used to snorkel over the nearshore reefs and admire the beautiful formations and the fish, and we call it sea moss. And of course, my learned colleague over there, Senator Rogers, said it's not sea moss. It was really varieties of seaweed. And there were over 300 varieties of seaweed documented in Barbados not too long ago. Now all we hear about is sargassum. And hence I have to commend the Coastal Zone Management Unit for the important work that they have been doing, indeed, in trying in restoration of our bleached and deteriorating coral reefs, I can call it, and in some cases, dying and dead. And obviously, this is a time that we all need to act urgently in the conservation of our marine resources. I'm focusing on that because that is what we're focusing on today, before it is indeed too late. Mr. President, Barbados is, at the end of the day, a very small island developing state. Like other countries across the globe, we are facing and battling the threats of economic decline, the climate crisis, recovery from the pandemic, and all of the various economic woes. But we must still press on in spite of all of this with matters of vital importance, the matters of the socio and economic development of our country and of our people, and of course, environmental sustainability, including, because we're an island state, our marine environment. Mr. President, of course, it is extremely difficult when our debt to GDP is hovering around 130. An improvement from where it was a few years ago, but not where we want it to be. And scarce funds have to be found and are being utilized for myriad other important purposes in our country. And we can see that. This situation makes the resolution, Mr. President, become extremely important and not one to be scoffed at and to engender fear about. As we seek to find a novel way, and I say that deliberately, to fund our marine conservation while not increasing our debt burden. I want to be absolutely clear. This is about finding a novel way to fund our marine conservation while not increasing our debt burden. Mr. President, I've done some reading. This is not my area. This area of certainly financial matters has never been my area. I just read and listen. But I had to do some reading, background reading on this one. The concept of a debt for nature swap, as I understand it, was first introduced back in 1984 by the World Wildlife Fund. And traditionally, there were three types of debt for nature swaps. There was a commercial or three-party debt for nature swap, in which an entity, usually a non-governmental organization, acted as a funder or a donor and purchased the debt title from a creditor on a secondary market and then transferred that debt title to the debtor country in exchange for a specific conservation activity. And in that case, the specific activity would be managed by that donor or funder, and in some cases, it was done collaboratively with the government. There's also the bilateral debt for nature swaps, which would occur between two governments, two countries, where the creditor country would probably forgive a portion of the debt, But the debtor country would then be allowed payment of the balance into a fund for a specific financing. In case of the US and Jamaica back in the 90s, the Jamaicans had to pay into a specific fund to finance environmental conservation. And then, of course, the third one, multilateral swap, a transaction between the debtor country and perhaps more than one country. In general, most swaps involve the replacement of a set of debt service cash flows owed to one creditor with a new set to a new creditor. And this is seen in the example of the Seychelles. The old cash flow were bought back at discounted face value with funding from a new lender, and this new financing with new improved terms, the savings then utilized to fund climate resilient projects in the Seychelles. Mr. President, government has been looking at this matter since 2019. I think you recall that we've just gone through the rescheduling of our debt and looked at a number of areas as to how they could implement a debt for nature swap. Of course, the example of the Seychelles was being portrayed as the latest, and probably Seychelles was singular in this. It was a small island development state, and this was the way to go. But when we tried to look at that model for Barbados, we faced difficulties, because far from finding the value of our bonds to be declining, when we looked around, we were getting them at par value. So there was no question of doing like the Seychelles and buying them back at discounted face values. That was not available. There was discussion, I can tell you, lengthy discussion in Cabinet about the matter, if we would ever be able to benefit. COVID came. There was a little dip in the market, but then it went back up. It's only early this year, with the matter of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we saw a significant, and this is globally, a drop in the bond market globally. And we came up with an idea that perhaps this was the time to try something new. With discussions, we've heard about White Oak. We've heard nebulous things about White Oak. We've heard nefarious suggestions about White Oak. But in this matter, they came up with a very interesting suggestion in terms of looking at interest. However, also earlier in 2019, the Nature Conservancy, the Chief Executive Officer of the Nature Conservancy, which I believe several of you are familiar with, it's a US-based environmental non-governmental organization, nonprofit. It has been established since 1915, is present in over 70 countries. It's had major experience. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, I've seen that they have been involved in conservation projects globally, over 119 million acres, and speak of thousands of miles of rivers that they have been involved in conservation matters. He met with the Prime Minister of Barbados regarding the swap, a debt to nature swap in Barbados, the possibilities for funding of a marine conservation or climate change adaptation project. I've mentioned the Coastal Zone Monitoring Unit twice already, and they had been doing a lot of work, but recognized that there was a lot more to be done. Our exclusive economic zone, not our territorial limit, our exclusive economic zone, which goes up to 200 miles from the shoreline, ours, Barbados, because of our geographical location, is about 185,000 square kilometers, well over 70,000 square miles, and about, some say, over 400 times the size of Barbados, or exclusive economic zone. And CZMU was very cognizant of this. During the time when the blue Economy, the Ministry of the Blue Economy, there was approval at Cabinet of a Blue Economy roadmap that spoke of and saw the need for a national marine spatial plan to be done for Barbados. Of course, these are expensive, involve consultants, and we weren't sure how we would get there. And of course, they have also been recommended, that is the Coastal Zone Management Unit, the need for us to look at our marine protected area, currently quite small, but figuring if we can do a marine spatial plan, obviously in that wider area, you could expand your marine protected area. So after 3-4 years of discussions and various models, we came upon a workable solution. It was determined that the government of Barbados would retire a portion of the Eurobonds and expensive domestic debt, and the interest saved from that process could be then pledged to support our project in marine conservation. Prior to that, there was need, obviously, for a National Conservation Fund, and hence the establishment of the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund. And I should mention at this point in time, before I forgot, that it speaks to the composition. And the full board, founder members, Government of Barbados, University of the West Indies, the Nature Conservancy, and then their ordinary directors. And I should say there's a full board of directors of 11 members, 7 of which are non-governmental, and 4 government representatives. And these include the Ministry of the Environment, National Beautification, the Green and Blue Economy, the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Barbados, the Barbados National Union of Fisher-Folk Organizations, the Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, the Barbados chapter, and Chartered Financial Analysts of that Society of Barbados. They rotate. So that was established. Mr. President, but the ability of the government of Barbados to issue debt at concessional rates have obviously been made possible by guarantees from the Inter-American Development Bank and the Nature Conservancy. And I know the honorable members in this chamber are familiar with this, because I believe a few weeks ago, there was a debate about the counter guarantee matter, counter guarantee act. Initially, in discussions with the IADB, they were guaranteeing US $75 million. And at that time, the Nature Conservancy, they were guaranteed 25 million US. Subsequently, the Prime Minister met with the President of the IADB, Mr. Clever Caron, and suggested that perhaps the IADB should look at increasing the amount that they were willing to guarantee and increase their project size to 100 million US. So they went from 75 to 100 million that they would guarantee. And this is something that the IADB doesn't normally do, because they are very cautious. They're AAA, but they're extremely cautious. Mr. Claver Caveron said that he was supportive of Barbados because of he could see the strong environmental impact of the proposed project. He's of Cuban extraction, Mr. President. I just mentioned that there. And also, the Nature Conservancy, following the IADB, they decided to increase what they guarantee from 25 to 50 million. So they were guaranteeing 150 million US. And I should mention also that this was the first time, with all the work of the Nature Conservancy, that they had provided a guarantee to any country in matters of this sort. In April this year, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs launched a request for proposal to 8 investment banks to provide or arrange financing for this project. These were Barclays, acting in conjunction with First Caribbean Bank for a portion of the transaction in Barbados dollars, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, BNP Paribas, Santander, Bank of America, Credit Suisse, and Citibank. And I should say, obviously, IADB and the Nature Conservancy assisted with the shortlisting of 4 of these. After the best and final offers were made, First Caribbean Bank, Barbados Limited, and Credit Suisse were selected. First Caribbean to do financing of Barbados $150 million for the prepayment of the expensive domestic debt of Barbados, and Credit Suisse providing $75 million US for the buyback of Euro bonds. Obviously, as I said earlier, the counter guarantee agreements of the IAB and the TNC guaranteeing the loans. And this resolution was debated a few weeks ago in this honorable chamber. Mr. President, the proceeds from these loans will be used to buy back or prepay existing government Barbados debt. Specifically, the $75 million US will go towards buying a portion of the government's $530.5 million US external debt, $75 million. And this is currently, the external notes is 6.5% interest and due in 2029. The Barbados $150 million outstanding, Barbados $2.2 billion domestic Series E bonds with an interest of 8%. This money will come obviously from First Caribbean Barbados Limited. So clearly you will see, and if I go to the term sheets, we can compare the interest rates. If I can find it. I said that the US, the overseas external debt was 6.5%. And on page 4 of the schedule, I see here, when we speak of the Credit Suisse, they to be fixed, the current indicative rate approximately 4.15 per annum for the external debt. So you're moving from paying an interest rate on this same amount from 6.5 to 4.15. Similarly, for the Series E bonds, you're moving from an interest rate, I said, of 8%, and the First Caribbean International Bank, the fixed interest rate of 3.25%. So you're moving from 8 to 3.25%. And obviously this net savings is to be transferred then to the Barbados Environmental Sustainability Fund. As you can see from the terms and conditions, there's mention of the natural disaster clauses, which speak to during the period of time we've struck, God forbid, by a severe natural disaster, there's a 2-year period where government is allowed not to pay towards the principal or the interest. And we've worked it delicately to also include a pandemic. It is expected, Mr. President, that over the 15-year period, this could provide between US 30 to 40 million of investment, of savings that could go into marine investment. Having established the fund and having this in motion, it allows the fund, with the assistance of the Nature Conservancy, to be able to look at acquiring donor funds as part of this process. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm speaking strictly here about interest, but I said that in the current trends, there's been a slight dip because of the global conditions, and we should also make some savings as it relates to the principal. Mr. President, and again, I go back to the actual resolution. It speaks to the terms and conditions, but it also speaks to the milestones. And the milestones are here. I don't propose to go over all of the milestones in detail, as they are here as part of the full schedule. It speaks about the initiation of the Marine Spatial Plan no later than 3 months after the signing of the contract guarantee agreements, the completion of the first draft of the design no later than 36 months. It speaks about milestone number 3, the legislative and regulations to declare this marine diversity protection zone. And I should mention here, and I've discussed it with some colleagues in here earlier and with the minister, that initially, within the remit of this Coastal Zone Management Unit, we were looking at very limited marine protection areas. We were looking along the coast and in our territorial waters. This speaks to 30% being a marine protected area and stuff like that. And I think that the focus now in doing the marine spatial plan, we have to look at coming from outside in terms of that 30%. Because it could be very disruptive if we were to start as where we were now and try to increase that to 30%. I mentioned the participation of the Barnufo in the actual fund, but it also as part of this entire process, and it has started, has to be engagement of the stakeholders, especially the fisher folk, who stand to be affected and also to benefit the most from this entire process, if carried out properly. I say that because obviously, Mr. President, I don't know about you, but by the time this is up and running, I suspect I might well be pushing daisies. There's a milestone 4, speaking about the gazetting, etc., and it's all there. So all I'm going to say at this point in time, Mr. President, is that one of the key I mentioned at the beginning, the Barbados Sustainable Conference here, that happened in 1994. But prior to that, there was a Rio Summit in 1992. And one of the key principles that came out of the Rio Summit was that development today must not threaten the needs of the present and the future generation. And therefore, Mr. President, I ask all, as I did at the beginning, at the outset, all colleagues on both sides of this honorable chamber to join me in supporting these resolutions, which will definitely inure to the benefit of Barbadians now and in the near future. With these few words, Mr. President, I beg that this resolution do pass. Thank you.
Senator Dreams.
Thank you, Mr. President. The former leader of government business, Mr. President, and now acting leader of government business, I want to congratulate him on going through the financials of the counter agreement in the way that he did. So it would save me a bit of time in explaining how the financial arrangement works and how it is different from other previous arrangements as it relates to debt for nature swaps. So the 2 resolutions before this chamber, as was mentioned, thank you, as was mentioned, is truly a reflection of where we are right now. Small island developing states like Barbados face great economic uncertainty, and we also have to deal with the challenges of the climate crisis as well and the impacts that come along with that. And sir, this innovation to the debt for nature swap, I think, is suited for the context of Barbados. As was mentioned, Mr. President, we were not able to go the route of having a debt forgiveness type of arrangement because our debt was still trading at par. Countries, let's say for instance, Bolivia, when they first did it in 1987, their debt was actually trading at 15 cents on the dollar. So you see the difference between where Barbados is in terms of where our dollar or our debt is trading versus a lot of the other countries that have problems financing and servicing their debt and going into a debt for nature swap, and then earmarking large territorial spaces for conservation use. But, Mr. President, I want to spend some time this afternoon on the specifics of the Marine Spatial Plan, because we have gone through the financial process in terms of getting the counter guarantee arrangement finalized, and that's why we're here today. And that is really based on us putting together a Marine Spatial Plan for Barbados as it relates to our exclusive economic zone. And there are some issues and areas that we need to work through as it relates to developing the Marine Spatial Plan and also the implementation of the Marine Spatial Plan. Sir, the first thing I want to say is, and I'm not sure if it was mentioned earlier, but people might be saying, you know, what is a Marine Spatial Plan? And the name is somewhat explanatory for itself. Essentially, it is a tool that countries use to manage their ocean scope in a coherent manner, and it ensures that the human activities that occur in the ocean space are done so in an efficient, safe, and sustainable way, and it's usually done through zoning. So you'll have various zones by which you have activities that are permissible and some activities that are not permissible, depending on the type of biodiversity that exists in those zones. So to say that, Mr. President, is to also note the importance, and this is the first area that I want to talk about, is data and data management. Mr. President, when we talk about our exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, and it being 400 times the size of our terrestrial space, that is a massive amount of area for us to manage and monitor in a way that is able to support livelihoods for the current and the future generation. And for us to effectively have a Marine Spatial Plan that is supported by informed decisions, then we have to ensure that the ecological integrity and the health of the marine resources in that space is captured. Sir, but in order to do that, in order to protect and manage, you have to know what exists. You can't protect something that you don't know if it exists or not. And as was mentioned, and I'll repeat it, and I have no issues in repeating this, the work that the Coastal Zone Management Unit has done so far, they've done a fantastic job in the collection of data along our coastal areas. I believe the data that they collect goes out to about 200 or so odd meters, give or take. So that is to tell you it's not a far distance out by which we have comprehensive data. When we get further out into the Atlantic, then, you know, the data just does not exist. We don't know what is out there, Mr. President. And to meet the commitments outlined in the fourth schedule of the debt conversion resolution, Mr. President, which outlines the conservation and sustainability commitment agreements, the aspirational goal of protecting 30% of your biodiversity in a particular area, you have to have the appropriate inventory of what resources are there and the health of those resources. As I said, closer to the nearshore, we do have an understanding of what's there because we've been collecting what is called LiDAR data, Mr. President, which is light detection and ranging data. It allows us to collect what is on the seabed, the contours, the different types of structures, so we know what types of coral reefs are there, we know what types of vegetation exists. So there's a good mapping of what's in our nearshore. But as I said, further afield, or further out into the ocean space, I should say, we don't have an understanding. And there are a number of other agencies that also are on the front line of collecting data. We have the Fisheries Department, University of West Indies, the Environmental Protection Department, all collecting various types of data. And that in and of itself is a good thing, but I'll also mention how we can improve in that area as well as it relates to the data collection amongst various departments. So for us to conserve 30% of our EEZ. As I said, there is data, but at the moment, there's no central data repository on marine data or even environmental data at the moment in Barbados. And if we are saying we're going to build out the blue economy of Barbados based on the Marine Spatial Plan, then we have to have a central repository of environmental data in Barbados, because that will be the bedrock by which you make your decisions, and you're going to understand how certain trends are changing as it relates to biodiversity, different pressures and challenges that may be affecting various marine life. So I think that that is an area that we have to look at. And I also want to state that in addition to having that central repository for marine and environmental data, that can also be a segue into us moving towards including natural capital assets in national accounting. Because once you have the collection of data in a central place, like we have with the central bank reporting economic data, you have that environmental data that is then coupled with your economic data to have a better understanding of how economic activity is either benefiting or costing us on our natural capital side. And that is something I think, a direction that we can move in. I know it will take some time. Most things take time because we have limited resources to put things together. But Mr. President, I think Barbados is going to be moving into an area of development that is quite different from what we knew previously. And if we are not aware of the value of our natural capital and how it is affected by human activity, how is it affected by economic activity, then we're creating a blind spot in our policy making. Mr. President, and persons might say to that rebuttal, you know, we do require environmental impact assessments for certain projects. But at the end of the day, you're asking private individuals to basically put environmental impact assessment that may be at the detriment of their own investment. So if at the national level we're already collecting in a very systematic way our own data for environmental resources, and it also then gives us scale and scope of the valuation and the cost of a lot of these other economic or investments coming into Barbados. And there's some approaches out there, Mr. President, that we can look at in terms of the streamlining of including the environmental assets into national accounting. The TEEB approach is one popular approach, TEEB, T-E-E-B, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and that allows you to have an idea of what are the economic and social values of the benefits of your natural capital, and that is able to then provide you with policy support. Mr. President, I raise the issue of data to make the point that we need a central repository for environmental data across the board, but also to make the point that in having that data then allows us to provide researchers with data that they can then apply knowledge. Data is only as good as the knowledge that is applied to it to make better decisions, to come up with innovative ideas. At the moment, we have a situation where a lot of the environmental data, as I stated before, is captured by various agencies, and in some instances, they're not shared. The data is not shared for various reasons. One area I will point out is nearshore quality, water quality in Barbados. That type of data does not see the light of day. It is kept within the Environmental Protection Department. They do that monitoring on a consistent basis, but that information is not shared. And I understand the reasons and the sensitivities around not sharing that type of data, but I think we have to move to a place if we want to really improve the health of our marine environment, then we have to be more open and transparent about the health of some of these natural resources. So that is one area in terms of the application of the data. And the more people who have access to it, the more knowledge is created, the more we have more information on it. And that's not just researchers, that may be businesses who want to now move into that same marine environment. They can do their own assessments of what's there, and there may be some new products, some new innovation that then the data then supports people moving into new businesses. So it's not just an academic exercise, but it can also support new businesses and new ventures going into the marine space. The other point I want to make about this, Mr. President, is when we talk about oceans, and particularly in Barbados, when we talk about beaches, everybody will say the beach belongs to me. It is a common asset, it is a common resource, it all belongs to Barbadians. If we are saying we're going to build out the blue economy, Mr. President, I think one of the things we also have to signal to Barbadians is we understand that this is a valuable resource, it belongs to you. Here are the hardcore observable facts as it relates to this information, to the resource. And what that does, Mr. President, is it empowers Barbadians to then be involved in decision-making when it comes to our coastal and marine space. If we disseminate the information on a consistent and reliable basis, like we do with the central bank reporting, I think that can also bring a sense of ownership, true ownership as well, to Barbadians as it relates to what is happening and the change of certain practices that we may see in terms of whether that's illegal dumping and littering on our beaches. I think that can also change the mindsets of Barbadians. And I'm happy that the acting leader of government business today is also has a substantive post of being the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because I also want to make a plea this morning that Barbados moves in the direction of possibly signing on to the Escazú Agreement. Because I think the Escazú Agreement is the first environmental treaty for Latin America and the Caribbean that guarantees the right to access environmental information and to participate in environmental decision-making. And thereby, it promotes access to information and access to justice relating to environmental matters. Moving in that direction in terms of signing on to the Escazú Agreement, sir, as we move into this process of planning the Marine Spatial Plan, I think that signals to Barbadians as an administration that we are also serious about ensuring that there's also environmental justice, a platform for environmental justice built into all of these other procedures that we're embarking on, Mr. President. So I'm hoping that the acting leader of government business heard that plea. Sir, the other area I want to speak to is managing competing interests. The Marine Spatial Plan, as I said before, is going to allow us to make certain zones accessible to various types of activities. And in doing that, because of the many users of the space, particularly in the near shore, we will have conflicting interests. We will have competing interests. So for instance, one of the things we'll have to confront is the possibility of, as we're moving towards 30% biodiversity protection, what happens in the event that an area, when the data comes back in, shows that it's a high biodiversity area, but it is also a common fishing ground or fishing area. What do we do in that type of scenario? What gets priority in that type of competing, as I said, competing interests? Another possibility, and something that is near and dear to Senator Rogers, is the issue of the destruction of coral reefs via cruise ship anchors. In the event that further afield we find that there are large coral reef banks, and even more so inland, Mr. President, what do we do in that regard? I'm not even sure if the regulations as it relates to the penalization of the damage of coral reefs has been instituted. So there are a lot of things that need to be conceptually thought through, sir, for this marine spatial plan to be effective. And I say that, Mr. President, speaking about coral reefs, so that people, it is not an ecosystem that a lot of people see, because a lot of people don't dive, they may go snorkeling, but if you're a diver, then you would understand the type of damage that these anchors cause. At the moment, the Center for Environmental Management and for Resource Management at CERMES at UWI and the Coastal Zone Management Unit recently produced a report on coral reefs and the health of coral reefs. And Barbados, out of a score of 5, scored 2.7 in terms of the coral reef health across Barbados. And 1 is being very poor and 5 is being very good. So we have, on average, fair health of our coral reefs. But what is interesting is the variation of the health of those coral reefs, particularly on the West Coast. The health of those reefs, the fringing reefs, is actually very poor. They scored 2.2. So when we're talking about the management of the marine space and things like anchor damage, we also have to take into account the health of a lot of these ecosystems, which are already under severe stress and are at risk, Mr. President. So in this concept of competing interests in the marine space, are we going to let economic priorities dictate, or are we going to let ecological priorities dictate, or are we going to find some balance that allows stakeholders to have a share in the marine and blue economy? Mr. President, there's another area I want to mention here in relation to competing interests and managing our ocean resources. Recently, it was said in the press, I read it in the press, it was at an event, but we heard that Barbados will be launching another licensing round for offshore oil and gas exploration. Mr. President, in hearing that, one can only ask if in one breath we are talking about marine preservation and conservation, but in another breath, it seems as though economic interests will still dominate the marine space. And you have to question if we as a country will not be at ideological odds when we're talking about these types of developments, because we're coming to Parliament, we're restructuring, we're refinancing debt, I should say, in order to fund the activities of the Barbados Environmental and Sustainability Fund and supporting a marine spatial plan. But yet, just this week, we heard of the launching of new licenses in oil and gas exploration. And as a nation, an island nation, Mr. President, that is so vulnerable to climate change and the climate crisis, are we willing to engage in activity that is the primary basis for the climate crisis? The role that fossil fuels has played in greenhouse gas emissions cannot be refuted. And do we as a country really want in 2022 to further encourage, seek out investment in oil and gas exploration in our exclusive economic zone? That is just a question, because have we really weighed the benefits and the risks associated with the activities of oil and gas exploration? And I'm not sure how many honorable members or Barbadians have ever seen the mapping of what is called the offshore acreage. But most of the blocks that are being put up on offer are in the southeast of Barbados. They line the north, the south, and the west, but most of it is in the southeast. So are we gonna have a situation or a scenario where we're issuing licenses, collecting data on what's out there in the marine environment, you know, identifying various biodiversity hotspots, and then having to renege on the licenses to say, well, no, you can't drill in that area because it is a highly protected marine conservation area? Or are we gonna say, no, we'll forfeit the marine life, drill for oil? These are the questions that you have to ask, Mr. President, and I'm sure there will be some form of rebuttal to that. But even in addition to that, Mr. President, there's some experts, some energy experts, when you talk to them, they will say that oil and gas is old technology. It is old technology. It is of the 20th century. Leave it in the 20th century. Yes, the money, the foreign exchange that we can earn is very much still very much current currency. But I have to still question if we're going through the trouble of refinancing debt and looking for money to finance conservation efforts and make sure that NGOs have grant financing to do conservation work, Mr. President. Why are we not looking at wave and thermal ocean energy infrastructure projects? That's new technology. That's green, that's blue energy, Mr. President. That's energy of the future. We're not going back, we're going forward. Barbados wants to become fossil fuel free by 2030. So it would only come to me logically that rather than oil and gas exploration, we would be looking at all of those investors who are looking for a safe, secure, beautiful place to work and live, to set up companies as it relates to developing wave and thermal ocean energy. But, Mr. President, I am not in the bowels of the government, so I'm sure the acting leader of government business today will give me some answers on these questions that I have. But nonetheless, Mr. President, what is also of concern to me is not just the offshore acreage being mainly in the southeast. That offshore acreage represents 40% of our EEZ. So on one hand, 70,000 square miles. 70,000 square miles. Square kilometers. I stand corrected. But if on one hand we're saying we're protecting 30% or aspirationally protecting 30% of our marine space, but yet 40% is already earmarked for oil and gas exploration, we're playing with around 70% already. Mr. President, I just have questions. And I'm also asking how involved is the Energy Division in the negotiations of the Marine Spatial Plan, so that we deal with these types of things very early on and we understand what it is that we want to do in our marine environment, Mr. President. Yeah? So there's one final area in terms of the Marine Spatial Plan that I want to speak about and that is the institutional framework and the governance arrangement. Sir, this is going to be a very complex area as well. Sometimes it is not that the idea that you have or the project that you have is not good, it is not beneficial, but just the complexity and the nature of it in terms of implementation causes it to fail. And at the moment, there are numerous government departments by which the Marine Spatial Plan cross-cuts. When we're talking about ocean governance legislation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the primary ministry dealing with the Barbados Territorial Waters Act and the Marine Boundaries and Jurisdiction Act. And then to implement and operationalize the MSP, a number of government agencies will have to collaborate to ensure the efficacy of the MSP. When we go into the Ministry of Environment and National Beautification, We have the Coastal Zone Management Unit, which is leading the negotiations at the moment and the development of the MSP. But you still have, as I mentioned before, the Fisheries Department, the Environmental Protection Department. The Energy Division should be a key voice in those negotiations as well. And also, institutions like Barbados Port Inc. will also be a major stakeholder in the MSP process. But at the moment, there's no single entity that is responsible for this marine spatial plan. And that in and of itself may not be a bad thing, but it may create a weakness in the process as we move forward. Because if there's no single entity being responsible for marine conservation and the marine spatial plan, then what happens is people pass the responsibility off to others, and then things don't materialize as they should. So, sir, there's a lot of technical work that, as I said, in relation, just even in data collection that needs to be done for this process. And I want to say that in terms of the scale and scope of the blue economy and utilizing our marine resources is actually unlike anything our generation has seen. And maybe because we do not utilize and use the marine space like some other countries, a lot of Barbadians are not, don't even know to swim. But the potential that is there is tremendous. And we are talking about funding the ESF with $40 million, US 40 million, just 30 or to 40 million US dollars over the next 15 years. But I want to say that that's seed funding, Mr. President. That is truly seed funding. We are talking about possibly $1 billion development area in the blue economy. And we are going to have to find some way of attracting investment that is sustainable so that businesses or foreign investors have a sound idea of what's in our waters and what we're going to allow in terms of development. So, sir, in closing, I just want to say that this new area, the blue economy, and the marine spatial plan that is going to be the underpinning of it, it cannot be extractive in nature, and it cannot be exploitative. And if we are moving away from the normal capitalist approach to development, Mr. President, I would like us to think of what kind of ethos, what kind of paradigm are we talking about when we're looking at development for the blue economy? Because, Mr. President, what is very clear is the development models of the past will not be fit for purpose for the future. And I think Barbados is in a very good position to lead in this area. We have the technical capacity. We are way ahead of a lot of other island states as it relates to the legislation, the data collection. And Mr. President, I want to also commend the work that has been done by various persons, the technocrats across various ministries. They've worked tirelessly to date to ensure that the best interests of Barbadians are served first in this marine spatial plan process. And Mr. President, with those words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drake. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow senators, good morning. Mr. President, when this proposal was first advanced in a previous meeting of the Senate in this honorable chamber, I supported the measure as I saw it as a government that was taking a proactive stance to treat with the challenges which we face in climate change. Today, I support the measure again. because it is clear to me that the challenges which we face in this world as a small island developing state will require significant funding, strategy, projects, and efforts to comply with our commitments, which we assumed when we signed the Paris Accord, but also to come to terms with what is now being defined by the World Bank in a recent report as urgent actions that are necessary to help reduce the impact of climate change and to set our country on a path of transition to a carbon-free economy as proposed by our government. It is not my intention, Mr. President, to enter into the analysis of the financial or economic dimensions of the proposal. I think we have in this chamber outstanding economists, bankers, and legal experts, both in this chamber and elsewhere, who can give appropriate testimony and analysis of the approach. What I do wish to say, Mr. President, is that the scientific evidence of global warming points to an expected increase in temperatures between 1.4 and 6 degrees over the next century, higher than was originally anticipated. These changes will lead to rising sea levels and more frequent occurrence of extreme weather events, hurricanes and droughts, violent storms, severe water stress in arid areas and semi-arid areas, such as in Southern Africa, in the Middle East, and in Southern Europe. We're already seeing the evidence in the fires that are taking over parts of Southern Europe. Decreased agricultural production in many tropical and subtropical areas. Higher worldwide food prices because of less production and less productivity. And the challenge we have of supporting a population that is increasing at 78 million people in the world per year. Major changes in productivity and the composition of critical ecosystems, particularly coral reefs and forests. And tens of millions of people who are at risk of being displaced as a result of climate change. Mr. President, here in the Caribbean, we are particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change with the frequency of violent storms, flooding, and wind damage, increasing the threat to our infrastructure. The impact of climate change have been seen very violently in the last couple of years in fellow countries in the region. And therefore, it is for us to implement appropriate mitigation and adaptation strategies to ensure the sustainable development of our economies. Mr. President, you will no doubt recall that Barbados signed the Paris Accord, the United Nations framework on climate change in 2015, in which we pledged to achieve an economy-wide reduction of greenhouse gases by 44% compared to the business-as-usual status, and committed to 100% green neutral island by 2030. Historically, Barbados has done much on the environmental issues and has been an advocate for more serious treatment from those who pollute the environment, especially the developed economies of the world. We have also expressed our concern about the changes in the weather patterns, including the potential for increases in the intensity and the frequency of tropical storms, the impact on our economies, and more recently, our government has made the case for appropriate clauses in our financial arrangements so that they take into consideration our vulnerability and our inability to repay the loans that we may take. The mitigation of these challenges require money, a lot of money. And therefore, the government must be commended for the approach that they're taking to secure the financial resources that can underpin the sustainability of this nation. I hope, therefore, that these funds will be used to contribute to a new awareness of the importance of our environment and encourage our people to protect and conserve our biodiversity for this and future generations. I hope that these initiatives will promote more productive use of our land resources, thus reducing undesirable vegetation and the overgrown lots, creating a more pleasant landscape in our country. To enhance the aesthetic beauty, I hope that this will help us to reduce erosion and land degradation, enhance water retention, reduce runoff, and strengthen our aquifers. Mr. President, I have one concern about the proposal, and that is that we have not been told of the specific projects that will be financed under this arrangement. Whether these funds will be used only by government agencies or whether they will be accessible also to non-governmental organizations who have a commitment and responsibility for environmental matters. Mr. President, if these funds are going to be used to eliminate the possibility of sewage being on our streets in the South Coast in the future, this is a good decision. If these funds are going to be used to strengthen the development of our national botanical gardens as a place of beauty and recreation for the people of Barbados, this is a good decision. If these funds are going to be used to continue to plant 1 million trees in our country to help reduce the threats of climate change and produce economic and agribusiness opportunities in our agricultural sector, then, Mr. President, this is a good decision. If we're going to study the ecology of the flying fish and the sea in order to make these marine products a sustainable source of food for our people, then, Mr. President, this is a good decision. If we're going to develop the Scotland District as a place of beauty, a place of ecotourism, and a place of agribusiness development, then this is a good decision. Let us invest in the control of the sargassum, which is a threat to the sustainability of our tourism industry. Let us give the environment a higher priority in our development paradigm. With these words, Mr. President, I lend my support to this initiative by the government.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator Hewitt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we exist in a world today where the vast majority of the targets set under the Paris Agreement have not been met. None of them stand out as a stellar hallmark to be followed. And year after year, many countries across the world, including Barbados, commit to the attendance and participation and contribution in terms of their inputs with regards to the COP. And year after year, many countries, many individuals as well, express a level of disappointment in terms of what was not achieved relative to what was exposed at those meetings. And Mr. President, that basically summarizes Barbados, in all honesty, showcasing that we are not a master of our own destiny with regards to climate change. And for the most part, those masters, for lack of a better word, really reside in terms of the activities of the developed world and the developed nations in particular, the ones with the highest per capita GDP, without calling any names. It is against this backdrop that I recognize our vulnerability and that I support this resolution as it converts a financial constraint into an environmental lifeline for this country. And it gives us much needed time to adjust both the human behavior as well as some practices of different species within the ocean as well, towards the betterment of our oceanic assets. Now, before I proceed into my presentation in terms of the meat of the matter, I want to just address a few comments for clarity. And I'll just repeat some of the questions that were asked previously. For instance, why are we, as a government, as a country, not looking into wave and thermal energy technology? And I suspect that it was really wave and geothermal energy technology, because thermal energy might imply that you run an iron across the hot pants and whatever you get off of there, you can generate electricity from that. But I suspect it was really geothermal. I really want to say that we are looking at them. There have been assessments in terms of wave energy. And I also want to say that as soon as the middle of October, the Barbados National Oil Company Limited will be receiving a proposal from an external entity in terms of a geothermal plant that could convert the heat from the earth into hydrogen. And that is just a proposal, not a commitment of the BNOCL or the government. So I just want to put that to rest. In terms of the Escazú agreement, in terms of sharing data and ensuring that all the information within the marine spatial area is accessible at any given time to anyone, in principle, I agree with the agreement. But I also want to draw reference to a lecture that was given by the Honorable Mr. Justice Winston Anderson, a judge of the Caribbean Court. And he spoke at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. And it was under the title, Why the Escazú Agreement Matters, Environmental Rights, Justice, and Public Participation in the Caribbean. And he summarized by saying, there is a challenge to consider how best to integrate many aspects of the Escazú Agreement into our jurisprudence. There are several such challenges scattered through the agreement. Even Article 9 on the protection of defenders of the environment, laudable as its objectives appear, has been seen as problematic by some. And that just kind of underscores, Mr. President, that even though the principle of the Escazú Agreement really and truthfully is laudable, there are still some teething issues that we need to work out within the Caribbean, largely so that we can adopt it in the most prudent manner. Also, most recently, there were calls in terms of, or concerns in terms of the specific projects under the fund that would be undertaken. We heard a number of them from Senator Bradford a few minutes ago. But I want to say it is really difficult at this stage, not even having the spatial plan, to one, determine in specificity all of the activities that would come under the fund, having not done the initial assessments as yet. And having not known the activities, then we don't know exactly which organizations to engage, because we don't know which ones will be fit for purpose. So the answer to that basically is that it is too early for us to determine exactly who will be involved, because we don't have the initial assessments which will guide the activities as well. I just wanted to put that to rest as well. I also heard, Mr. President, a concern, and a very relevant concern, in terms of there being a conflict of interest exploring energy in the exclusive economic zone while undertaking a marine protection area at the same time, or spatial assessment that will guide the marine protected area. I want to say that the exclusive economic zone really runs from the shoreline to 200 nautical miles, whereas in most of the marine protected area assessments, we're talking about the length of the pelagic zone, or twice the size of the pelagic zone. So pelagic zone runs from 200 meters to 6,000 meters. In some cases in Grenada, they've extended their MPA up to about 12,000 meters. We're talking at 200 miles versus roughly 6,000 meters. I'm saying that to say that the spatial mapping that will be undertaken, to my estimation and my understanding, will not cover the entire exclusive economic zone of Barbados all the way out to 200 miles. Just want to put that to rest. So we can have a situation where there is a marriage of exploration in terms of energy within the exclusive economic zone, while at the same time establishing a marine protected area. I just want to put that to rest, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, this resolution goes way beyond C plus G plus I plus X minus M. This is not an economic debate from my perspective only, and I'm certain the Honorable Senator Drake and yourself, who's also a student of economics, Mr. President, would know very well what I refer to in terms of that terminology, which is just the calculation for GDP. I think so, I can be corrected. But this is really about the environmental protection, or the protection of our environmental zones, the pelagic zones, and all the other zones out there in the ocean, and the utilization of strategies that would combat the activities that we have as humans within those specific zones. It is nothing new either. It is nothing new, Mr. President. As far back as 1981, we would have established the Barbados Marine Reserve, which was about 2.2 kilometers, which is 2.2 kilometers, 4 zones. The scientific zone, it has a northern and southern water zone, and it also has a recreational zone. So spatial mapping is nothing new to Barbados. What this particular assessment seeks to do is to basically have a review of that and other assessments that were undertaken, and come with a more substantial proposal which accounts for the changing international environment within which we operate as well, and gives us some perspective in terms of the social, the economic, and the environmental activities that take place, as the former Speaker, Senator Drake, mentioned in terms of the activities that takes place in the biodiversity that exists within the zones. So it is nothing new to Barbados. I believe that this also speaks to the fact that we're in a situation in Barbados where we cannot benefit from some of the other benefits that countries have taken advantage of. Back in 2004, Jamaica also had a debt for nature swap, $16 or $15 million thereabout, Mr. President, and they established a fund as well. Let me get the exact name of the fund here for you. Let me get the exact name of it, because I'd like to call the name just to ensure that we have a bit of clarity, Mr. President. I can't find it, but it was a forestry fund that they established. But it is very much similar to what we're doing here in terms of taking the proceeds and investing into a fund and generating activities that would then benefit the environment and ensure that there's a lot of sustainability, not only environmental sustainability, but economic sustainability. Because behind establishing the fund and the activities, it means persons have to work to preserve these areas. Back in Carriacou, in Grenada, There was an arrangement when they first established the MPA to ensure that there's monitoring of those protected areas between Carriacou and Grenada. And who did it? Not the police officers, but the fishermen. And the fishermen were given a stipend, schedules to travel between Carriacou and Grenada, also Petite Martinique as well, and ensure that there's no one really infringing on the established protocols and ensuring that there's no one fishing within those designated areas. So the fund will stimulate some economic activity, and it will ensure that there's a high level of monitoring ongoing with regard to the activities to protect the specific areas. Oh, it was called the Tropical Forest Conservation Fund for Jamaica. Let me just go back to that one. And it was also a debt for nature swap. Mr. President, we don't benefit in terms of carbon credits. We don't have any substantial forests in Barbados. We can't apply to the UNFCCC or any other entities that participate, like Norway, for funds for forests. We don't have it. Interestingly enough, the Caribbean has an abundance of different species of seagrass. And similar to what was mentioned in the other place 2 days ago, I want to establish my disappointment, but also offer perhaps some suggestions that we can document the fact or be proponents of the fact that these seagrasses, particularly within the Caribbean, but seagrasses around the reefs, are responsible for carbon sequestering at a higher rate than even any of the forests anywhere around the world. And they extract more carbon than any forest, pound for pound, than any other forest in the world. So I think this conservation fund, the activities, and I don't want to preempt what would come in that spatial mapping assessment. I don't want to preempt what would come in terms of a new marine protected area. But I suspect that activities such as that, in terms of planting along the coastline, could be an activity that would help us propel the protection of the environment as well. There was also some concern expressed, and this is going to be one of my last points for sure, in terms of conducting assessments and calling for need for there to be assessments with regard to the Marine Spatial Plan. I suspect it wasn't a concern, it sounded like a concern, but I suspect what was really intended was to say that the speaker was intended to say that she was looking forward to the assessments to be undertaken, because that is one of the primary things that has to be done in any marine spatial plan. You have to do an ecological assessment of what is there. You have to do an assessment that involves not only scientific, but also the economic activities in terms of if there were fishermen, if there were persons participating in sports in the area. That assessment has to be done. And when we collect any data with regards to the scientific assessment, I understand the need for the access to the data, but I go further to say that I believe we may also need to look at the telemetry systems that relay the data back into the repositories as well. Simply because we need not only data, but we need real-time data. Time and time again, when I used to work in some other agencies, and we had any project proposal to create for Barbados and the Caribbean, we always went back to documents that were 10, 20 years ago, when we have access to the data at our hands, but we don't utilize the tools to collect the data on a regular basis. So therefore, we're looking to do climate change adaptation strategies, and we're going back to 1995 and 1976, and which are relevant for baseline information, but the times have changed. So I think in addition to a call for access to data, we also need to look at the telemetry systems that relay the data back to the data sources that can be accessed in real time. So, Mr. President, I conclude again by saying that this resolution, though it may have been given, though the impression might have been given that is about a lot of finance and swapping and this and that, has less to do with the financial aspect, or C plus G plus I plus X minus M, but it has more to do with the protection of the marine environment and the sustainability of livelihoods of those persons who engage within those environments. So, Mr. President, with those few words, I thank you for the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Herod. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I am lending my support to this bill, which will seek to have the Barbados government enter into an arrangement where it will buy back 150 US million of our total debt stock, with the aim, further aim and the further benefit to our marine environment. So overall, what is happening? We have a situation where everyone will be aware, because of what we inherited back in 2018. We had the third highest debt to GDP in the world, a debt to GDP of 176%, 4 weeks of foreign exchange reserves. Within a week, the government indicated to the country that they were in a situation where, because of the unsustainability of the financial situation, that we would have to undertake some kind of restructuring exercise in order to make our financial footing more stable. What we're doing today is a little different from that. I know people get excited when they hear the word debt nowadays, but this is actually something that is very, very good because it will cost Barbadians nothing while adding benefit to our natural marine and coastal resources. So what we're doing is that we are buying back 150 million US dollars of our total existing debt stock. That is a combination of external debt in the form of Euro bonds and domestic debt, which are Series E bonds, which would have been due to the NAS. So the NAS, through this arrangement, will actually see an injection immediately, increasing its liquidity to the tune of 150 million Barbados dollars, 75 million US dollars. And how the arrangement is structured and how we're accomplishing this is that the higher interest debt associated with the Eurobonds, the interest rate on the Eurobond was 6.5%, the interest rate on the Series E domestic bond was 8%. What we're basically doing is exchanging this expensive debt for lower cost debt. So in the new arrangement, our new interest rate will be 3.7% compared to 6.5% and compared to 8%. So it is through this mechanism that we're actually going to be able to generate the cost savings. And what the cost savings will see is about $2.4 million approximately, 2.4 million US dollars annually going towards a special fund and a marine and coastal protection trust that has been established by the government, but not to be used as a slush fund. The funds aren't going into the consolidated fund or anything like that. It's a special fund that will have specific terms in terms of how it's governed, how it's managed. And the fund, as Minister Walcott would have earlier made representation to, is comprised not just of representatives from ministries and government departments, but by a US-based nonprofit called the Nature Conservancy, which is well established. It has a presence in over 71 countries. It has been involved in the debt for nature swaps that we've seen in the Seychelles, in Belize, and the earlier one in Jamaica that other speakers have made reference to. And it's also seeing a collaboration done with the local scientific community and the local business community. So there's a broad base of representation who will be working along with this fund to make sure that we accomplish the objectives that have been outlined, because when you're getting a benefit like this, because we're actually backed by the Nature Conservancy as well as the IDB, we are actually using their credit worthiness as a front in order to access the money at this lower interest rate. So obviously there will be terms that come along with this, and the terms are actually tied to us meeting specific milestones as it pertains to our marine and coastal protection goals. So there are 5 specific milestones that are elucidated in the actual bill. But one of the things that we will be doing is establishing a national conservation plan with the ultimate goal of establishing that our exclusive economic zone will have to be preserved. About 30% of it will have to be preserved, keeping in mind that our exclusive economic zone is about 440 times the area of our land area. So we have a rich array of marine resources, and we're actually now able to use this as leverage to tap into this special kind of arrangement. The debt for nature swap is allowing us to kill two birds with one stone. We're able to avert a debt crisis while taking action against the climate crisis, while also allowing us to pay early and to return some funds back to our creditors. So they will be quite happy to see them getting at least some of their investment back in a way that will signal to the international community that Barbados is serious about meeting its obligations. So why have we decided to do it this way? Surfacing our debt. So debt, although it has a certain connotation, debt has a lot of important uses. We would have tapped into debt in order to buy the electric buses that we have. So we would have tapped into debt to purchase the new garbage trucks, which are all retrofitted with the lifters and all of that stuff. Each of those trucks cost 440,000 Barbados dollars. We would have spent about 45 million Barbados dollars to get the new buses. So progress comes at a cost. It takes money in order to advance the country in the way that we want to and to meet our developmental goals. So debt is not always a bad thing. It depends on how the debt is applied and whether we're able to access that debt at concessional rates. So what we're actually doing is quite progressive, quite exciting. One of the things that I also took note of in reading the bill is that, yes, there is a natural disaster clause where if, God forbid, Barbados is impacted by an adverse weather event, a hurricane or a major storm, that it would allow us not to have to make payments for 2 years. But it also has a special pandemic clause, which I believe is the first time in the world that a pandemic clause has been included in a debt arrangement. So it is quite progressive in terms of how it has been designed. And I want to give credit to all of the officials and technocrats who would have had a role in seeing this through. So Barbados is not unique in terms of its debt situation. It's something that's very common to small island states, which is why you would have seen places like Seychelles, Jamaica, and Belize all take this route before us, all in different iterations and in different ways. But I wanted to make note of the importance of this in another way, because I took an opportunity to investigate how valuable and how vast are our marine reserves. And what I was able to find is that the Caribbean actually has 10,000 kilometers of coral reef, 22,000 kilometers with mangrove, and 33,000 kilometers of seagrass. It also is home to the largest barrier reef in the Western Hemisphere, the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, which is with Belize, housing over 14,000 different types of biodiversity, really incredible stuff. But our vast resources have actually been depleted over time. I also found a statistic that showed that between 1977 and 2001, about 80% of the Caribbean's coral reef stock has been depleted. So we can no longer afford to just allow our oceanic reserves and biodiversity to be degraded. So here we are trying not just to fix a debt situation, but to the longer term benefit of our marine environment. When we talk about the benefits of the marine ecosystems and all of this stuff, we always think about people diving and snorkeling and perhaps it being more used for leisure and for tourism, but we have to remember that the ocean also provides the livelihoods of our fisher folk. Those reefs actually shield the coastline from being battered by waves during storms. So when you consider the economic losses that we've seen over the years, whether it was what happened when Hurricane Dorian affected the Bahamas in 2019, the 70,000 people in the Bahamas were displaced by that. When we saw what happened with Antigua Barbuda, where they were impacted by Hurricane Irma in 2017, and Barbuda was literally left desolate, uninhabitable. So we can see the extent of the vulnerability of our islands, and therefore it should be a no-brainer why these kinds of investments should be made in our coastal and marine spaces. The other thing that I wanted to speak to beyond the fishing, the diving, the fishermen, coastal protection, is that even from an economic standpoint, yellowfin tuna is Barbados' #1 fish export. As the water gets warmer, the fish start to migrate northward. So what does that mean? There's so many different areas where you can see that there could be a knock-on economic impact if we don't look after our coastal and marine areas. So I wanted to take a little look at Belize's case scenario, because they actually had the largest debt for nature swap in the world. A lot of people would make mention of the Seychelles, but I think their debt for nature swap only involved about 16 or 18 million US dollars, whereas Belize actually undertook exchanging all 100% of their external debt, a $553 million US dollar super bond, bought back all of their external debt, and what they did was create something called blue bonds in order to finance that arrangement, in order to protect, obviously, home to the largest barrier reef in the Western Hemisphere. You have vast marine resources that require protection. So you can see why these instruments would be quite useful for small island and developing states like Barbados, and I'm glad to see that we have decided to follow suit. Just in closing, I wanted to say that debt ultimately can be a good thing. We've seen situations in the past where debt has wrapped up, sometimes with nothing or very little to show for it. But if we're making investments in our people, if we're investing in education, if we're investing in infrastructure, if we're investing in development, if we're investing in preserving our environment for generations to come, it is an investment and an undertaking that is well made. I would like to credit the Prime Minister for her leadership on the international scene as it pertains to creating a space and speaking on behalf of not only Barbados and CARICOM, but all small island developing states. You all would know that she was awarded the Champions of the Earth Award by the UN Environmental Program. She continues to lobby at the highest levels, even at the UN, on our behalf. And it is important for countries like ours, as she makes these statements, that we fulfill on our obligations. So even things like investing in electric buses or adjusting the tax rates downwards so that everyday Barbadians can actually afford to have fossil fuel-free vehicles, or like the former Minister of Maritime Affairs last World Oceans Day 2021, he actually indicated the intention to implement what they're calling nearshore marine areas that they're going to preserve. There's a stretch from, I believe, Weston to Folkestone on the west coast, and then one from Pierhead down to Rockley on the south coast. So while she continues to lobby internationally, I think it's important that we in our own space ensure that we are doing our own part to make sure that we are also walking in lockstep to what is being said. And with those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Haynes. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Good morning. Oh, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Time has really got away. Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. How do I begin? I wrote some things down before I got here, and then I've listened to all of the very useful contributions, I have to say, from the other senators. I really did appreciate the explanation provided by Senator Walcott. And I have to say, I think he did a good job of explaining what is going on here, because this is an area that can be a little bit confusing. So thank you for this. I appreciated the discussion of the 1994 SIDS conference, because I actually remember that conference. I was one of the dancers that was in the opening of the conference because they took children from schools. I wasn't a little child, but I was one of the children that actually danced at the beginning of that. And we went on some school tours to Barbados Community College, where I believe they had some kind of, there was some kind of village or something. So we went on the tours with the schools.
The Village of Hope, NGO,
Village, right.
NGO Village.
So I do remember it. And I have to say, I was really excited by a lot that I saw then as a child. And I went to school. I also asked my parents to carry me back again. I found it really quite interesting to see all of the environmental technologies, and I thought this is such a futuristic thing, and we are going to make these differences, right? That was in the 1990s, and alas, 2022, still hoping to see a lot of these things, and one expects that an initiative such as the one we are discussing today in these two resolutions will help to take us away towards this. I still have some questions though. One of the questions is, where are we meeting today? Why are we meeting on a Friday after this meeting was called on Monday? And the reason I ask this question is, am I to assume that this is an urgent matter that has caused us to be here after this was only discussed in the other place on Tuesday? Is it an urgent matter for us to discuss? And I really do appreciate that we want to get these things moving. It is important for us to speed up the pace at which we initiate these sorts of initiatives because environmental matters are critical. Also critical. And I heard in the debate in the other place, because I made an effort to try and listen to it so that I know, what are we talking about? I am not necessarily an expert in finance. I know a little bit. I used to teach a course in international environmental politics, so I feel like I know some about the environment stuff. So on that side, I felt a little bit comfortable, but I really wanted to have a firmer understanding of this. And for me, as a person that likes to understand things and to prepare, I wanted to have some more time. But I listened to the debate, and it was very good as well, I have to say. I appreciated some of the clarity that was offered. I got some information about the work that went into this. This is not something that just happened this year, but it was long in the making. Much appreciated. And I also heard that us having these resolutions, this is an effort towards transparency. And of course, I'm all for transparency and accountability, doing what one says one will do, presenting documentation. These are good things. I'm glad for them. I commend the government on these things, although I have to say that these things are limited. And the reason I say that they're limited is because this was debated on a Tuesday, and today is Friday. We had 4 days to look at these documents, and certainly I can read documents in 4 days, but I do not want to just read the documents and come here. I would like to be able to take a deeper dive, to do research, to explore myself, not looking for oil and gas or hydrocarbons, but I would like to explore what this means. What I want to look at the terms of this agreement and find out for myself. I don't want to just trust. I trust things, right? But I don't want to have to go on faith and trust and sitting, listening to people saying, this sounds good. This sounds really good. And then reading it for myself and saying, well, I heard these things, they sound good. I read this for myself, it seemed good, so it must be good, right? This is not transparency. It's not adequate transparency. So we know about good, things are good, and then there's better and best. And I think this is good, but I think that we can do better. Why do I think that we can do better? Because one of the things I think that troubles people in our current environment is we voted to give the current government all 30 of the seats, right? All. So that is a show of confidence. But I think there is this niggling concern about lack of other kinds of voices and questions. And the reason I say it's a niggling concern is because sometimes people ask questions and we hear the word mischief being used. There is mischief about, always is. People ask questions and they are called naysayers, all kinds of terminologies. I don't want to get into that too much. But in an environment in which the government holds a lot of power, and governments always hold a lot of power, I think it is important to be better, to go that extra mile to ensure that we can provide the check that this place is supposed to provide. And how is it that we are going to provide this check adequately without certain time frames to analyze information? Now, I'm saying this, I was not on the government side. I don't know what is happening. There are certain people that know. I am not one of them. I don't know if people on this side are privy to certain information, but I am not, nor is the general public of Barbados. Consequently, I would like to have more time to analyze things for true transparency. And I'd just like to take a minute to read a little something, because I don't want this to seem as if this is specifically criticism of the government. Not specifically, right? Because I think this is something that is systemic. So I just want to quote or refer to, there's a book, The National Integrity System and Governance in the Commonwealth Caribbean. It is authored by my colleague, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles. And in it, if I may, Mr. President, Professor Barrow-Giles talks about the fusion of power that exists in our system between legislative and executive functions. So she's speaking about the cabinet. And she goes on to say, this is on page 32 of her book, she talks about the advantages of this fusion. It provides for efficient and decisive decision-making. And these are things that we need in order to deal with our problems. However, she continues to note that one of the concerns surrounding this approach is that it does not lend itself to transparency. So this is systemic, right? I'm not specifically talking about a particular government, although in this case, obviously, I guess I am. She goes on the next page, page 33, to note that given this combination of the fusion of these powers, our first past the post system, it leads to, and I should probably read this part because I don't want to misquote her. She says, Parliament has been virtually rendered as an ineffective tool of political and legislative accountability. That's what Professor Barrow-Giles says. I can read the whole paragraph, but I do not want to bore people. But she talks about, given the above, and in combination with the first past the post system that encourages exaggerated support for winning political parties, Parliament has been virtually rendered as an ineffective tool of political and legislative accountability. Okay, fair enough. So this is systemic. Considering this, and considering that I do take my role in here very seriously, I want to state very clearly that there are limits to the accountability that we have in our system, and in light of these limits, I would wish to be able to have the space to assess information and hold the government, the legislators to account the best I can within these limits. What does that mean? No matter what I come in here and say, we know what the outcome is going to be. But I would like to be able to speak in a very informed way on what is before me. And I do not think that we received adequate time to do this. I understand that things may be urgent. Everything must be urgent for somebody. This may be urgent for some entity. There are other things that are urgent. I asked a question in here since the 4th of May. The answer is urgent to me too. It's urgent to people who are in the juvenile justice system to find out what is happening with child protection legislation, and there is no response. But I digress, I can bring that up another time. The point that I really want to make is that we require greater time in order to scrutinize things appropriately. But before I run out of time, I don't want to linger much more on that. I believe that my point is made. What I do want to say is that I have some questions, and my questions are similar to those that Senator Drake raised. I have some questions about the Marine Spatial Plan and the connection between the Marine Spatial Plan and our plans to offer 22 blocks for hydrocarbon exploration. So what's the connection between the two of these? And I know that there's a lot of space out there, and perhaps as Senator Harewood noted, there is sufficient space to allow for a marriage between the two. Perhaps there is. But one of the things that I also know is that the sea, the ocean, it doesn't have any barriers, right? It don't have any walls or anything that say, well, this piece here wall off, the oil piece wall off, and the rest. And when I look for myself, I try to find some information. Where are these 22 blocks? The 22 blocks are all over. There are some that have already been put forward for exploration under the previous administration in 2015. The blocks have some really attractive names, I have to say, Black Belly and Beige and Cherry. And I saw two of them, and one of them, Carlisle Bay and Bimpshire, like Browns Beach, that lovely beach that I like to go to in that general area. I would encourage people to see if you can find out where these 22 blocks are. And considering where these 22 blocks are, how is it that we are going to find this marriage? Happy marriage, right? Because they got all kinds of marriages. How are we going to have a happy marriage and a peaceful one? Not just a long one, not just one that exists between protecting the marine life, providing, for livelihoods, allowing for recreation, cultural uses of the beaches, leisure, all of these things, and not just the beaches, I want to say, but the sea, the ocean, everything. How are we going to find this? And I hope we will. I trust that we will. However, I don't have enough information to make me feel comfortable with that. That is okay. I know that these things are under development, and I hope that they will be adequately developed. But I do think that we have to continue asking the question about being champions for climate justice in a climate emergency, and still doing something that contradicts that. And I get the argument that if we find these hydrocarbons, we can use some of the income we generate towards becoming carbon neutral. That kind of sounds to me like if you have a drug problem, you can sell drugs to invest in drug rehabilitation. You cannot do it. If we're going to be genuine and talk about climate emergency, we have to, sometimes it means that you may have to leave the hydrocarbons in the ground because we don't want to feed the very thing that is causing us this emergency. At least this is my opinion. All right, so we understand that we will have a foreign exchange ease and that there will be some funds returned to the National Insurance Scheme, and these are things that are wonderful. I also commend the government on helping us with our debt problem and using an innovative scheme. These things are commendable. Therefore, I offer my cautious support for these resolutions. I think in principle, they are very useful things. They illustrate that we can be creative and find good ways, one hopes, to address our problems, both on the financial side as well as the environmental side. But I cannot stand here acting pleased about my ability to fully address, interrogate, and investigate what these mean for Barbados, and to do the job that I believe I have in here to provide some type of check on all of our government. With these words, Mr. President, thank you, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Malado.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me. I am going to be, as normal, short, hopefully sweet. I believe it was the 7th sitting of this honorable chamber, I learned a great deal about debt for nature and counter guarantees. In fact, my colleague Senator Drakes and Senator Hines and other senators, I learned a great deal from you on that day. And we passed the substantive legislation, if we might call it that, that facilitates these two bills that we are talking about today. However, one item was left to be discussed or disclosed later, Mr. President, and that was how the savings and how that came from these more favorable terms was going to be utilized. And today now, we see from these two instruments, we have a bit more details about how these savings, substantial savings, will be used. You know, that's really important because, Mr. President, we need to meet the obligations that we have under these agreements. We are only getting these savings because we are obligated to do something with those savings. And secondly, we have an obligation to make sure that the benefits that are to be derived from those investments do actually come to fruition. In other words, we need to use the money wisely. Interestingly, I had a phone call a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it wasn't so long ago, from a very learned person who I did not know, but a very reputation went before them. And they offered me some advice in my journey as a new senator, and said that perhaps sometimes I need to understand my audience a little better, and it is not just those here in the chamber, but that there are lots of people at home and lots of other people who are maybe listening. That was in fact lost on me, Mr. President. I didn't know anyone really watched us at all, but anyhow, I was glad to hear that. So I want to put in my simple terms how I would explain, I think, to someone who asked me about this debt for nature, and I'll put it in the way in which I understood it in my personal terms. I would give as an example that perhaps my interest rate on my mortgage on my house was very high. And the bank would say to me, I'll give you a lesser interest rate, but the savings from that interest rate, I want you to reinvest in your house. I want you to renovate the kitchen, paint it, fix the roof, because the asset itself, you will make it better, and me as the bank, and you as the user of the house, we'll all be better off. So when the public who are listening to this, because when we hear 250 million and 600 million, it gets beyond my understanding of these big numbers. When I think about it in those terms, and you were to say to me as a bank, I will drop your interest rate, but renovate the kitchen or fix the roof, because the underlying collateral now is actually going to be better off, I can understand those terms. But what that does though mean for me is the obligation that is placed upon me, and Mr. President, this point is what I want to get across. There is no change in the cash flow for me. While I no longer have to pay the interest to the bank, I still have to take the same amount of money out of my pocket, pay some to the bank, and pay some to fix the roof. We are doing the same thing here. Let us not leave this chamber with it unsaid that this does not change the cash flow position of the government of Barbados. The money still has to be paid. Less interest, which perhaps is going overseas, and more towards investment. Now, we all know that as individuals, that is a good thing. It's kind of like, don't pay rent, pay your mortgage, because now you own the house. At the end of the day, the same amount of cash goes out of your pocket, the same part of your paycheck. But at the end of it, you have something to show. Rent, you have nothing to show. A mortgage, you might own the house at the end. The same thing here. So that leads me then to my final point that I want to make in supporting these measures. I would insist, if that is possible, my learned friend has told me that, you know, really and truly, we can say a lot of things here, but it will be passed anyhow. But we have an obligation, a significant obligation. And the four things that I would ask that we might learn more about and that we might commit to in supporting these two resolutions, and there will be more to come, is that one, the savings is segregated from the consolidated fund. I have seen how we're going to set up a trust and so on, but I want it to be explicit. The savings must be segregated. Number two, that the savings must be accounted for independently. Let's hear what they really are. I've heard the difference in the interest rate. Everyone has talked about that. But that's not where the savings is only coming from. Some of that savings is going to be eaten up in administration and fees and renegotiation of, I'd like to know specifically how much of this money is now going to go towards these causes. So firstly, segregate it so that it cannot be used otherwise, other than for the stated purpose, because, Mr. President, we are obligated to do so. Number two, account for it independently. Let's get a third party involved who can show that what we have done, we have met those obligations. Number three, audit it annually so that we don't have this situation that we see in other places where it's 10, 12, 15 years and we can't get an audit on these matters. They should be audited. Let's start this right from day one. We're doing it now, audit annually. And finally, disclose it transparently. So those four aspects, I will support this. I supported it on the 7th sitting in principle. I support it in the detail of what we are doing now, having understood what it is. It is a very good thing to be done, but let us, in the execution of it, not forget to segregate it, account for it independently, audit it annually, and disclose it transparently. With those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malado. Any more speakers? Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good afternoon to you and my colleagues. I thank you for the opportunity to just say a few words on these resolutions that are before us. But I'll do so within the context of my experiences over the last few weeks. I've been taking a bit of break from my duties in other places, and it has given me some time to reflect upon life and what is taking place around us. And no doubt the events of the past few days in the context of our world also give us an opportunity to think about what is happening to us. I speak particularly of the passing of the former head of the Commonwealth, Queen Elizabeth II, who there have been many debates surrounding her passing and her tenure. But what I think we can all pull from it was her dedication to service for the cause to which she committed herself, whether we agree with that cause or not. Certainly we cannot deny her dedication to the cause, and perhaps it is something from which we can all learn. And I say this against the backdrop of a particular line in our national anthem, our brave forefathers sowed the seed. And I was reflecting on how we are those brave forefathers. We are those brave foreparents for our future generation, because the present is really the past of the future. And that brings me to what we're doing today. I want to impress upon the public of Barbados, in addition to what has already been eloquently said by many of my colleagues here within the Senate, that what we're doing here is nothing new. It is not rocket science. It is something that is done by people in their everyday lives. But let us not fool ourselves. We are still in a hole. We're still in debt. Nothing has changed. What we're doing is simply, as both Senator Hines and Senator Malalo pointed out not long ago, is putting any benefits to be accrued from the change in our interest rate to something that can be developmental for our people. And so we're really laying a foundation so that hopefully, generations to come will sing of us. Our brave foreparents sowed the seed from which our pride is sprung, that they've done something to ensure the sustainability of ourselves and our children in time to come. Senator Walcott would have spoken about the fact that I reside in St. George, but my roots are really in Bath, St. John. And so I know about going down to Bath Beach with a maypole and going out to get sea eggs. That was before the restrictions. I also know about going out on the shoal with a grain to get sea cats and so on. So I've been there. It's nothing new. But I believe that we really need to pay some attention to what we're doing here in this particular bill and some of the concerns that have been raised by some of the senators before. And I too have some concerns. And part of my concern would be, and this is just for the general public, I'm sure the technocrats and the members of cabinet would have already thought through these things, but just for the general public, I wish to raise this concern. To what extent would the determination of our protective areas be determined by foreign entities or entities that are not locally based? And if so, what would the restrictions be in these protective areas? Do we control that as a nation, or will those be determined for us? Will there be an external influence in those things? And I'm raising this because I believe that some of these things need to be ventilated in the public, especially for our fisher folk. Because we can very well be here supporting something, and I do intend to support this, but I also want us to pay close attention and to at least ventilate within the public what are the ramifications of these agreements. Because during the last few weeks when I've been taking a little break, I had the opportunity to snorkel around a little reef on the island, and I looked at the beautiful fish that were there, and I imagined some of them in my pot and so on, and but I couldn't catch them. I just raised this to make the point that we do not want a case where our fishing stock here in Barbados is just there for us to look at while we spend money importing from other people because our protective areas have been determined by others on the outside. I just want to put that out in the public space. But I also want to speak to something that Senator Drakes would have spoken about and Senator Hines, which would have been our potential oil exploration. I think it's something that we need to mention to the public of Barbados, even though we may not want to. We will never, ever be 100% fossil fuel free. Let's not fool ourselves. It's a reality. All right, so I think we should, as Senator Drakes would have pointed out, try to find that balance into where we can explore for our own personal domestic uses and other things, and where we ought not explore, as Senator Hines would have pointed out. I would hate to think that something called Carlisle Bay something, I'll see a couple of oil platforms down there. I think we can do without that, but there may be other areas that we can look at. But let us not fool ourselves. We have to find that balance, okay? And also, as Senator Hines spoke about the ability to prepare and to have the time to do the necessary research, it is something I would have mentioned in here before to remind us as a government that there's a difference between the goals of a political party and the goals of a government. A political party is there to decimate its opposition and to form the government. The government is there to see after the needs of all the people, the territory over which it presides. And the mere fact that it has been raised here again, Senator Hines is not speaking for herself. She speaks for a public. And if there's the perception that because we have numbers, we can do what we want, Let us remember, as someone said some time before, 30 out of 30 is not 100%. And it led me to the words of Edmund Burke, the great English lawmaker in the 18th century, when he said, "Because a half a dozen grasshoppers hidden under a fern make the field ring with the noise of their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle sit in the shade of an English oak chewing the cud and are silent, pray do not imagine that those making the noise speak for all the inhabitants of the field." Do not imagine that those making the noise speak for all the inhabitants of the field. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Rogers. Senator, Mr. Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like Senator Rogers, in my short time, I've seen the disappearance of the sea egg. And this government is displaying the maturity that's needed to probably stop, if they can, some of the things that will happen. And this resolution seeks to provide funding whereby the government can fund at least part of what needs to be done in the future. And it's interesting that he's chosen an NGO to manage in some way in the overall savings and how it will do things. NGOs have worldwide done significant and important work in all aspects of our lives, and they're often not recognized. And I rose, Mr. President, specifically to say a thank you to the late Dorothy Cook Johnson, who did tremendous work for this country during her lifetime, particularly for those who had cancer, and her work has not been wasted, and it will not be forgotten, and there will be many who will take it on, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. Senator Mr. Walcott.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm well aware of the time, and I know that some honorable members must be having and feeling the pangs of hunger. But I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. At the outset, I want to commend all honorable senators for their contributions in this matter, a matter of importance to all of us in Barbados. Senator Drakes, I know that this is an area which is near and dear to you, and I've taken some copious notes as relates to some of your comments and your suggestions. I know that you have also been involved to some aspect in the planning for the Marine Special Plan, so I know you have a certain amount of insight into what is happening. And as it relates to those who are participating, and unlike some of other colleagues within this chamber, will not be aware of the wide umbrella, so to speak, of persons both in the private sector, the stakeholders, especially the fisher folk who have been involved in this process and are represented, as I said earlier, on the board of the actual fund to be reimbursed. I didn't go into the details, but they've expected that they will have to benefit in terms as it relates to funding for various projects. The matter of the central repository for environmental data is absolutely necessary, and I've made notes of the issues raised by my comrade as it relates to real-time utilization and availability of data. Of course, there's need for a major education project, as it relates to Barbadians and the importance and the values and the valuable resources there. We've had discussions about the agreement already, and it's something that Foreign Affairs is pursuing. The matter of, you know that I share some of the issues, and they're being discussed as it relates to the development of this marine protection area and its boundaries, and will we start near to the coast or will we start further away, and those things are still to be worked out. You went into the whole area of hydrocarbon explorations. You can hear me. For your benefit, Senator Malado, I'll take off my mask so that I'm not accused on television of not wearing a mask in a closed space. Anyhow, you went you took a dive into the Atlantic Ocean and into the matter of blocks offshore. And where you went, others went also after you went there. You were very delicate and you spoke about the normal things that we have to deal with at the international level, speaking about climate change and the effects of climate change, while going to Houston to do another launch of blocks. Immediately I want to say that in statements, certainly made by the Prime Minister and others, we have not said that there will be 100%, 0% use of hydrocarbons. I don't think there's any country in the world, even the ones that are saying that they're achieving 95%, are not there yet. So it is something that we are mindful of. In relation to the entire Marine Spatial Plan, it is said and it is understood, and Senator Drake, you quoted it, 70,000 square kilometers to the southeast of Barbados will not be, has been reserved for a marine hydrocarbon exploration. And this has been in effect since 2007. I heard Senator Hines speaking about Carlisle Bay, and she said this after speaking about mischief, and that people are accused of being mischievous when they're seeking information. And imagines going to Carlisle Bay, her favorite beach, and seeing oil exploration rigs. Now, Mr. President, the blocks. Surrounding 90% of Barbados is a block called Bridgetown, encompassing Carlisle Bay and all of the beaches of Barbados. St. Lucie to the tip, it goes into a block called Moses. Carlisle Bay and Bimshire are in the southeast, in the same area I spoke about that is dedicated for oil exploration, hydrocarbon exploration, hundreds of miles away. Indeed, Carlisle Bay the area is 2,498 square kilometers. Bimshire is 2,506, and there are not 6,000 meters away. Indeed, the water depth is at 1,200 and 2,000 meters. So I would like to see any honorable senator in here swimming and enjoying those conditions. As you can see, they're just north of the established border between Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago. If I might go on, in 2007, there was a licensing round. The 24 blocks were put out. There's one called Blackbelly too, just between St. Lucia and Barbados. BHP was awarded 2 blocks, Carlisle Bay and Bimshire, 2007. There was another offshore licensing campaign in 2015. Blackbelly block, Blackbelly, the one here, to the northwest of Barbados, 2015, was awarded to the Spanish oil and gas company, Repsol. I believe since then Repsol has reneged on this and another company has taken over that. In April 2015, the government of Barbados and BHP signed the exploration licenses for Carlisle Bay and Bimshire blocks. And that is as it is now. I think you would understand if we have done that, then clearly that area, that 70,000 square kilometers, cannot be part of the spatial plan. Senator Drakes, you also raised the issue of the use of wind, wave energy, and thermal energy. And I tried to show you across the chamber that is in fact a document where the government has also been looking at wave energy, wind, offshore wind, onshore wind, wave energy, thermal energy, and then there's a matter of hydrogen. So these are all things we are looking at all of it. But as you correctly said, they all are quite expensive at this point in time. And perhaps we are still going through the process of trying to get someone to come on board with us in this respect. We have a pressing ahead with photovoltaics. I take your point as to who, in the end, who will lead the process. That is vitally important. And I agree that we will have to attract major funding as part of the process. And I noted what ethos, what paradigm will be used in utilizing our MSP. I noted it. As I said, I commend all of the other senators. Oh, Dr. Hines, you spoke also about the urgency and why the urgency in the timeline. I think those persons who know me on this side know that I've always had a problem when I was leader of government business with matters being debated on a Tuesday, you know this, and being brought to the Senate on Wednesday. In this case, that was the suggestion. It wasn't carried out. I thought the senator, honorable members of this chamber needed a few days to be able to do this. Obviously, the matter is of an urgent nature. I think you will appreciate that. Professor Cynthia Barjas, I'm going to try to get a copy of her book. But as you did say, it was not specific to any country. I believe it applies to perhaps all countries in the Commonwealth to begin with, and several others. It is indeed, I know Professor Barjas quite well, and she has some very good ideas as it relates to governance, to campaign financing, to transparency. And she is a unique, I don't want to say, from a unique brand, so to speak. I've told her once or twice that she should be in politics. And that is a better place where she could try to change the political landscape, even in St. Lucia. I recommend it. Mr. President, again, I am thankful for the support that the honorable members of this chamber are seemingly willing to give the government as it relates to these resolutions. And as it relates to the first resolution, I beg to move that that resolution do not pass. I believe we have to do it for the second one.
The question is that, just give me order right. We did order number 7, I believe, Mr. Clerk. Pedro? Order number 7 first? Yes. So the question is that this resolution related to order number 7 do not pass. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This resolution is no pass.
It's actually order number 4, sorry.
4, I thought 7 sounded wrong. Just for the record, order number 4, the resolution, just make sure I have the numbers right, trying to find out on the order paper. Order number 4, resolution in
Yes,
accordance with section 4 of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022-12. Was the one that we had approved. No, my leader seems to not hear me clearly. Just for clarity, we did order number 4, and this is a resolution to approve in accordance with section 4 of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022-12. Put the question again just for almost clarity and the smoothness of the record. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Order number 4, the resolution related to the section 4 of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022-12 is therefore passed.
Order number 5, sir. In the name of the Honorable Acting, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 2 of the Special Loans Act, Chapter 105, the borrowing by the government of the sum of approximately at A, Barbados $150 million from First Caribbean International Bank, Barbados Limited, and at B, Barbados $150 million from Credit Suisse International to buy back and prepay existing higher costs of government of Barbados debt and utilize the savings to finance marine conservation in Barbados on the terms contained in the agreement.
Senator Walcott.
Mr. President, I beg that this resolution do not pass.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is therefore now passed. Senator Walcott.
Mr. President, this brings us to the end of government's business for today, and I beg to move that this sitting do now be adjourned, sine die.
Mr. President?
Yes, Senator Dr. Hines.
On the matter of adjournment,
Yes.
I refer to my question asked in this place on the 4th, I believe it is the 4th of May, 2022, for which I have not received an answer. I wonder if such is forthcoming and what the procedure might be before we adjourn.
Senator Walcott.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm taken aback at this point in time. Perhaps I said that information be provided when the specific information which is required, also the time frame for reduction. I wouldn't want to answer questions in part. I see A is 2 questions, and then there's a B. I would say that the answers will be given shortly, I'm certain. But I won't want to give you part of an answer and not be able to give you a specific time frame. I know that you were very clear on time frame, so I would not want to mislead you and the Honorable Chamber at this point in time.
Ms.
Yes, Senator Driggs.
Mr. President, before we adjourn, I also want to somewhat reiterate something that was said earlier. And I want to formally state my displeasure with the logistics of how Senate is currently being administered. At the moment, we are scheduled to meet on Wednesdays. It has come to my attention and to some others in the chamber that we are now meeting Mondays, Tuesdays, Fridays. It has now become an ad hoc situation. Some of us, Mr. President, we have our own private business. We block off Wednesdays for Senate sittings. It is extremely inconvenient when we're being called on Mondays or any other day of the week except Wednesday to sit. in addition to wanting to come prepared, we want to come, we want to be present. And I'm asking those who are in charge of the scheduling of the Senate to be cognizant that some of us have professions that we have to be rescheduling surgeries and all other forms of business. And we take what we do here seriously, and if it is that Senate is scheduled to meet on Wednesdays, that it does so. Mr. President, the last sitting of this chamber was on a Tuesday. There is no way any of us could have contemplated that because the House, the other place, meets on Tuesday. So I'm just asking that we kind of regularize, standardize when we meet so persons can be at least bare minimum present for the sit-ins. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Maynard.
Mr. President, I too rise to add my voice to this issue. Mr. President, some of us have had to reorganize our lives on entering the Senate to be available on the normal meeting day, Mr. President, which has been taken as Tuesdays. And Wednesdays, Mr. President, when we've reached the stage where we now meet on days randomly, one is unable to fit in the important business of the Senate, or one has to cancel one's professional obligations to other human beings. And it's difficult, Mr. President. And I would like us, Mr. President, to return to some order, Mr. President. The more shocking example has been the Tuesday meeting, Mr. President. No one could possibly anticipate that you will set Senate for the day the other place meets. Mr. President, I hope that you can bring your influence to resolve the matter. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Senators. I will raise those matters with the leader of the House. The clear intention is for the Senate to meet on Wednesdays. However, you'd appreciate that from time to time, where circumstances may warrant, the leader of the House may, based on the exigencies of the moment, make other proposals. But I certainly agree with you that that would be the exception rather than the norm. The leader of the House is not here, of the Senate is not here today, but it will certainly pass those sentiments and very practical concerns and considerations with her. And certainly, I would agree that once we could keep to regular schedule, it will make it much easier where we do have to deviate based on the exigencies of the moment for everyone to be able to make that exceptional deviation from their schedule. So thank you for raising those legitimate concerns. Senator Dr. Hines.
I know we all want to leave, I want to leave, but Mr. President, I would like to reiterate that it is important that not just I, but the people of Barbados receive a response to the question that I asked in May. The question asked about the time frame to deal with, and I understand that Senator Walcott does not have the response, I understand that. But this is an issue that is also pressing to some people, and it is very important. Child protection is very important, and having answers on how we treat to this is not something that I believe should take 4 months to get a response to. I'm not saying that the child protection legislation has to be finished. I am just asking a question as to the time frame for this. And I hope that what I am saying here impresses upon those who have the responses the importance of providing this place and the people of Barbados with a response to the question, not the legislation, not to fix all the problems. Just let us know what the time frame would be. Today we met because the matter was urgent after 3 days, and I'm just asking if after 4 months, I can't receive an answer. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Walker.
Mr. President, certainly, I wouldn't want to give the impression that we don't have an intention of bringing this legislation. I believe this has been discussed in cabinet quite recently, and it is government's intention to have this legislation laid certainly before December the 31st this year. But I can't give you the specific. Might well be well before that, but certainly before the end of the year. But that doesn't answer your question. I can't give you the specific time.
Thank you very much, Senator Walcott. Thank you very much, Senators. The question is that this sitting be now adjourned sine die. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, and this sitting stands adjourned.